how does it actually feel to inhabit another person's experience as much as we possibly can?
Lauren Sandler was a journalist covering homelessness in New York City when she met Camilla, a woman without a home who didn't seem to fit the homeless stereotype at all.
You know, the first time that I saw Camilla, she was like dressed out of a J. Crew catalog. Perfect makeup, perfectly curled hair, sitting with like a little Kate Spade bag on her lap. And she was just like the picture of this sort of beauty and poise.
Not only that, but Camilla was pregnant too, and a criminal justice student who understood all the ins and outs of the social services system like nobody Lauren had ever seen before.
I just had this moment where I thought, I need to see how this person makes it out of the situation that she's in, because if she can't, then who can?
Shadowing Camilla brought Lauren face to face with her own privilege in a way that would challenge anyone's idea of the American dream.
Many of us can't make a massive difference individually, but we can as a collective.
Yeah, it's hard, but it's not the end of the world, even as we know it.
Welcome back to Fireside with Blair Hodges. Lauren Sandler joins us by the fire to talk about her book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. It's an up-close and personal story of one woman who shares the fate of millions of Americans battling homelessness and the stunning, boring, inefficient bureaucracy of it all.
The story of poverty in America for so many people is about gender, as much as it's about race, as much as it's about education, as much as it's about housing, as much as it's about motherhood, as much as it's about psychological trauma.
This is episode 9, Home. Lauren Sandler joins us from Brooklyn today. Lauren, welcome to Fireside.
Hi, Blair. I'm so happy to be here.
We're talking about a book that you published a little while ago called This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. And before you started on this particular project, what came to mind for you when you thought about the word homeless?
Oh, it's such a good question. It is a word that has been significant to me for a really long time. You know, I'm someone who's always grown up in urban environments where homelessness is very present. I grew up in the Boston area in the 70s and 80s, where it was just a common thing to see people sleeping on the street. And then I moved to New York in 1992 when homelessness was considered, you know, a national epidemic. There were between 1 and 2 stories about homelessness in the New York Times every single day back then. And that's when, at least in New York, we had 20,000 people a night sleeping in city shelters. When I started reporting my book, that number had more than tripled, and we had stopped talking about it. And so my initial sense of homelessness was very much like an urban street homelessness, which is a mistaken sense of homelessness. What that word represented to me was not the right thing. It was limited, right? It's what we often picture.
Is this sort of like the solitary man, bearded, sitting on a sidewalk with a cardboard sign, and like that is homelessness?
Totally. That's completely what it was in my mind for so long. When, of course, you know, we know that for a lot of people, homelessness is sleeping in your car or crashing on a friend's couch, or for many people like the protagonist of my book, who's a very real person, named Camilla, it means being on the subway in full makeup and clothes from H&M like everyone else who's on the subway, and not being recognizably homeless at all, but then taking your baby home to a shelter at night and not knowing how to find stability because the system is so hell-bent against her finding stability. And so I would say that it is something that has expanded with not just my reporting, but just my awareness of how multi-layered and distinctive this problem is all throughout the United States. So, you know, homelessness looks different in Provo, for example, than it does in Times Square. And yet the systemic roots are the same.
And you said about how media coverage dropped off. What do you attribute that to? How did it disappear from the pages even as it was increasing?
Oh, man. I mean, we could have like a really long, heartbreaking story about the shift to the right in normative culture, about readers determining so much of what gets reported now because clicks are measured in different ways, about the growing power of luxury goods and luxury advertisement. I mean, I became a journalist in the mid-90s just as the internet was really kind of taking off. Like right after Salon and Slate launched, I actually started off at NPR. So I knew a not-for-profit model where readers and consumers were not driving topics in quite the same way, and where it felt like there was a real appetite to go deep and tell much harder stories that are painful, stories that are intractable. And I think that increasingly our media landscape is one that just feeds people what they want. And that's also true for publishing. I mean, it was really hard to find a publisher who wanted to, that's not true. It wasn't really hard. It wasn't the slam easy dunk that we thought it was going to be, to sell a book which was narrative nonfiction, reads like a novel, suspenseful, dynamic, gorgeous, tenacious, central female character, story of motherhood. Like, my agent thought that this book had everything, and that
like it's made for a film. Like, where's the movie?
Well, that's a different conversation that we can have, which is also a cranky one.
Okay.
But, the feeling was meeting with publishers was like, well, we had the book Random Family already. And Random Family is an incredible book by a writer named Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, which she reported in the 90s in a totally different era, a totally different New York. And it felt like, God, so we get to have, it isn't even about homelessness, but it's like we get to have the one immersive book about a family in poverty. Now we have Andrea Elliott's Invisible Child, but it's like we have to wait 20 years between these books while we keep telling the same stories about people in different classes, in different crises that aren't necessarily this one over and over. I do think that there's a bit of a shift right now, which is a good thing. But yeah, I mean, in terms of our media landscape representing the lives of people who actually live in this country in any form of demographic, I mean, I think we all know how skewed it is, and how this is what happens when you have a totally advertiser-driven capitalist system that tells us what is real and what we should care about and why.
Okay, so you've given a pretty good glimpse of what the book is. It's not a data dump. It's not just a bunch of statistics, but you do start the book out by pointing some things out. It's sort of like you wanted to get the stats out of the way before you could dive into this personal story. So, for example, you note how most people in poverty are women of color, are single moms. There's a staggering statistic that 1 in 30 kids in America is homeless. It's 2.5 million kids. So you get a lot of these stats out of the way, but then you dive into this really personal story. Is this a book that you had a clear vision for, or did it emerge in the process of doing reporting about homelessness?
This is a book I had a very clear vision for. I was feeling very deeply that those statistics, and by the way, those are pre-pandemic statistics.
Yeah.
They are much worse now, and in fact, they're quite unknown now. They're also statistics that as eviction moratoriums begin to lift throughout the country it's just going to be a tidal wave. But we'll save that heartbreak for another part of this conversation, perhaps. Yeah. In terms of the authorial vision, I'm a journalist, but I really read novels. I mean, I read a lot of nonfiction, but when I think about what has most moved my heart, the moments in which I really find books working their magic, it's always character-driven narrative, which is usually fiction. Sometimes it's narrative nonfiction. But to me, there are people doing data journalism, good data journalism. We have numbers. There's a ton of information out there. But unless we can actually feel how those numbers are lived, not just like in a short form, try to imagine it, but how does it actually feel to inhabit another person's experience as much as we possibly can? That was the purpose for me. I mean, I think that the numbers can be scary and overwhelming and don't really... They can feel
I can't wrap my head around them, really.
It's shocking. It's shocking, and I do believe it's the measure of our society. But there is such an overwhelm to that. We almost shut down about it. It's hard to, I think, have your hearts and minds changed, the hearts and minds of a society, by looking at graphs.
Well, I think we're seeing that with COVID as well, with death numbers.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing. We see these numbers and it can seem like just a number. Same with these numbers of homelessness stats.
It's inuring, and in some ways it is quite literally dehumanizing. It is turning people into numbers. And frankly, These are people who, if they're in our social services system, already live as nothing more than their number, usually, in the social service system. And so it was really, really important to me to give a reader an experience of this is what it feels like. And you know what? It might not feel the way that you expect it to feel. There are complications. There are ups and downs. There are ways of seeing it as so much worse than you might know it might be, and also feeling moments of hope, feeling that hope crushed, having the whole process of life lived out. That's the magic that books do, is you can step inside another person's life. And so that was really my goal. And in fact, it was the original idea. So this book follows one woman very, very closely from, the day that her baby is born. She goes into labor in her shelter in Brooklyn, and all the way through her first year of motherhood for her baby's first birthday. But initially, the idea was to focus on 4 women. I started doing some reporting in a shelter, and I was going to situate the whole book in the shelter. But then I learned, oh, right, people get evicted from the shelter, of course, and they vanish. And when this extraordinary woman's eviction came up from the shelter, it was this moment in which I thought, okay, do I follow her or do I stay in this situation and let her be another person who vanishes? And she had given me the privilege of such openness and such access to every minute of her life, her past, her feelings. It was such an incredible gift as a journalist and as a person. And she was such an extraordinary person to follow that I felt like I just needed to stay with her. So it was initially a bit more of an ensemble piece, but it really did become just this sort of bullet train with Camilla.
You remind me of a quote that I just happened to see. I shared it on Instagram last night, actually. It's from James Baldwin. It says, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever had been alive. I think you're right. These stories, I don't know. I'll let James Baldwin's words stand for themselves.
I love that you read Baldwin and you're like, I think you're right. Like, oh yeah,
I'm not going to restate Baldwin. He's Baldwin.
What Baldwin said, that's what I meant.
Yes.
It is usually what Baldwin said, that's what I meant.
Yeah, yes. So as you mentioned, Camilla, she's the woman that becomes the focus of this book. And what was she like when you first met her?
When I first met Camilla, I'll never forget meeting Camilla. I wanted to report in a city shelter. So New York City has, a huge number of shelters that house a huge number of people and are paid for with a huge number of tax dollars and are infamously mismanaged and I think a bit of a tragic place. Although we have in New York a right to housing law, which means that we actually do have these shelters. And if you can't fit into one, you will be put up in a hotel room somewhere until you can be. It's an unusual and very important law that happens to not have enough funding and management behind it to make it what it should be. That said, these city shelters do not permit journalists inside, which to me is a massive miscarriage of justice.
Well, let me say that I think the argument from the shelter would be they're protecting clients' privacy, right?
Yes, but there are a lot of different arguments like that get made. Hospitals make those arguments, and then you can appeal to the head of the hospital and work through PR and get clearance. Factories have these rules. Pretty much any place that people can't just easily walk into, where there are elements of risk or personal trauma, etc., in play.
Okay.
Occasionally, journalists still get to go report on them. Not so with New York City homeless shelters. And so, I think that if I was someone with more money and more time, funny how those things tend to go together, I would have sued the system to try to get in as a journalist and then open up the precedent for more journalists to be able to enter, witness, etc.
Okay.
But, I may have mentioned I'm a freelance journalist and an author living in New York, not exactly an abundance of either time or money. So I found a private shelter in the neighborhood of Park Slope in Brooklyn that admitted women for 1 year when they were pregnant or in their first months of motherhood, and they were either supposed to be in their last trimester, I should say, or in their first months of motherhood, and if they weren't kicked out, they could stay there for a year. And I went and spoke to the woman who headed the shelter, and she said, honestly, I need someone to run this Wednesday night meeting. If you're willing to do that, sure, report. I don't care what you do. And I said, okay, well, this is a little tricky. And she said, okay, well, you'll work it out. And I did. And sometimes you just have to work it out. And so I showed up.
Part of working that out was Camilla appears.
Well, sure. But also part of working it out was showing up at that first meeting and saying, I'm here to lead this meeting. I am also writing a book. Anyone in this room, anything that you say is off the record, unless you tell me that you want to participate in this book. If you tell me that you want to participate in this book and then you change your mind, there's nothing about your story that I will use. There is no power here where something is going to happen to you at this shelter if you don't participate. I just want to witness this, and this is why. And then I didn't take my notebook out for weeks. And, gradually a few people opted in. There was someone who then decided at a certain point that she didn't want to participate anymore, and that was fine. But Camilla was all in, because Camilla was someone who I think really, really wanted to be seen and really believed herself for good reason to be exceptional in many ways, and I think wanted to be seen as exceptional. So Camilla, the first time that I saw Camilla at that meeting, she was like dressed out of a J. Crew catalog and, perfect makeup, incredibly pale skin, incredibly thin, perfectly curled hair, sitting with like a little Kate Spade bag on her lap. And she was just like the picture of this sort of beauty and poise that, in a colorist society represent something significant, in a society that expects women to present themselves in certain ways, especially if they are women of color and women in poverty, definitely presented something. But that wasn't the thing that impressed me the most. The thing that impressed me the most was that she instantly started talking to the other women in the room about what all of their rights might be at a birthing center versus what their rights would be in a traditional hospital setting, why doulas mattered, how they could start learning from this natural birth guru from back in the day who wrote a very, very famous book, and I was such an epidural girl that I'm completely blanking on her name right
too,
now.
So exactly.
I literally looked at the guy who gave me my epidural in the hospital and said, I could kiss you right now. I haven't felt this relaxed since I found out I was pregnant. But, but that wasn't Camilla's experience. Camilla, really, she just wanted to investigate everything and arm herself with so much information. In fact, she was a criminal justice student. And she knew and understood the ins and outs of the social services system, the public education system, hospital rights, you name it, beyond like anything I could have imagined. And she sat in that room and she started talking to these other women. And I thought, who is this person? Why is she here? And how did she become who she is? And you could feel all of them feeling the same way, like sort of feeling like, on the one hand, who's this uppity girl lecturing us? Others sort of like in thrall of her charisma. And I just had this moment where I thought, I need to see how this person makes it out of the situation that she's in, because if she can't, then who can? And that was in my head through all the time I spent reporting this book. It's why the book is about her almost more than anything. Is she isn't a case study. She's a very, very real person in a very, very broken country. But it did feel like, if she can't make it work, I mean, what is this? And, there's a lot of suspense in this book, but I don't think it's too much of a spoiler alert to say that she can't. And that is the true indictment of society that this book, I think, offers, is that even this person who is a criminal justice student has like the most brilliantly legal mind I could imagine, who can do paperwork forward and backward and carry dates and numbers and figures in her brain and has, documents in her backpack or in her diaper bag at every time, like just completely equipped to manage the impossibility of poverty in this country and of homelessness in this country and of being a single mother with a baby, Dominican American woman, you name it. I mean, it was piled on her, but it just felt like if this person can't end up in this situation with a home, with stability, on her way to whatever is ambitious for her, like what is this place? How are we calling this a just society?
That's Lauren Sandler. She's a journalist and author based in Brooklyn. Her works appeared in Time, the New York Times, Slate, and other places. She's also worked on a number of NPR programs like All Things Considered and Morning Edition. We're talking about her book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. So if she can't get out, who can? Take us to that beginning of the book where in chapter 1, we're with you and Camilla and pretty much nobody else in a delivery room, and she's alone. What do you remember about that day when she has a baby?
Blair, I wasn't in the delivery room. I love that you thought that I was. I was so careful. Oh, it's so I love this. This was a really tricky thing in writing this book, is I wasn't always there in every single situation with her, but she would tell me things over and over and over. I would fact check them, and I would just need to sort of highlight the moments in which I wasn't in the room with, she told me, or something like that. Like it would just be a little wink at, I'm getting this information from Camilla. But she was all alone in the delivery room. The person who she believed was the father of the baby, who she hoped was the father of the baby, was in Buffalo, New York, and was going to come down once the baby was born. The person who we find out eventually was the father of the baby was nowhere to be found. Camilla had some real tethers to her family. She is a mom. She has sisters. She is a dad. She knew her mom wasn't going to show up. She thought her dad probably wouldn't show up. She had hoped that her sisters were going to show up, but no one shows up. And it's just her and the nurses, and she's this great dynamic with these nurses, which reminded me so much of my own delivery room experience with these incredible people who, if you've ever had a reason to be in a maternity ward, my God, those nurses. But she just ends up alone. A lot of the reporting that I did, I was there for. And a lot of the reporting that's in the book that I'm not there for, she's texting me in real time. Mm-hmm. And some things, for all narrative books like this, you have to report it out and kind of fill it in retrospect. And so there we were.
Yeah, I should say the quote here says, it's hard for us to imagine that things could get worse than going into labor in a homeless shelter and giving birth utterly alone. So there it is. But Camilla would look back upon this time in the hospital with nostalgia. So you're kind of setting the stage for us, giving us a little bit of background here about American social services. Things have changed over the years. And the fact that you're zooming in on one woman's story kind of lets you take a look at those bigger systemic changes and how they actually impact individual people. So we meet Camilla's mother, who herself was a single mom in poverty, but she had, in some ways, more opportunities than Camilla had. She had an easier time than her. What are some examples of ways that things have actually gotten more difficult over the years?
You're right that she had an easier time. And yet, Claire, I have a hunch that you feel this way too. Like, even that language feels like, how can we think about being poor in the 90s as easier than now, when it's still like, when that was still the era of welfare reform and poverty was such a huge issue in the United States. And back then we felt like, how can this get any worse? Yeah, I mean, it's reminding me of what you said about statistics, about homelessness, about COVID, et cetera. Like, the worse things get, the more you get inured to things. And it was just really bringing me back to that sort of like Clinton era moment of feeling crisis. And now thinking, right, but that crisis at least allowed Camilla's mother to pay for an apartment with a Section 8 check, so that as long as the landlord was accepting that check, she could raise her kids in relative stability. They could have an apartment. They could stay in the same school district. They didn't have the same trauma and fear around the level of housing instability that exists right now. And Yeah, I mean, in addition to our housing market changing, which is obviously outside the social services system, but it is something that we choose not to regulate by policy. I think a lot about something that in the early days of the pandemic, there's this guy who runs a homeless shelter in Seattle said on a Zoom with me, which is, it was that moment when no one could buy hand sanitizer and people were price gouging on the internet. He said, so people are going to be in uproar saying that we need legislation to limit the cost of hand sanitizer, but we're not doing that with housing? Like, what is this? So obviously things changed on that side, but also Section 8 dried up. Pretty much anyone who works in housing inequality can tell you that unless supportive housing, which is housing with, a lot of mental health support and other services, is a real necessity, housing vouchers are the ways to keep people housed, to cut the cycle of generational poverty, to raise kids in stability. And even though that's like pretty much a universal belief with just legions of evidence behind it, we got rid of housing vouchers for the most part. Public assistance is something that was developed to help white women if their husbands died so that they wouldn't have to go to work and they could raise their babies at home. And when our world shifted and it was more women in color who were applying for public assistance, then all of a sudden those checks started drying up and the whole thing was about, you got to work, work, work. And there's like, I don't know, you probably know the statistics better than I from reading my book more recently. But, what a public assistance check as like the most basic need coverage has been deemed to be has gone from like $1,200 a month to like $230 a month.
While prices have actually increased on
completely
all the things
on
that they're trying
everything.
to buy. So less money for more expensive things.
It's just the center cannot hold. The entire puzzle is broken.
Part of the problem that you highlight, too, is that Camilla sort of bought into the myth of America, you call it, which is this idea that if you can get an education, then you can get a career and you can get out of this cycle. And this was her plan. Like, this is how I'm going to get out of this. But there were so many things that were stopping her from doing it. Give us a sense of some of those obstacles that she faced. All she was trying to do was finish a degree and get employed.
Yeah, I mean, it's, basic things like, here she is, a criminal justice student, amazing grades, incredible ambitions. She's admitted to transfer into John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is a public university in New York, which also happens to be the greatest criminal justice school in our country. If she can find a stable place to live, she can go to that school. But she can't, in part because her homeless shelter needs her to be working. Her public assistance needs her to be working. The people who she meets with at the welfare office tell her, you should be picking up cans in the park, or you should be, working in a restaurant, or you need to find some way to make money, whatever it is, as though this education is not for her, that working at McDonald's is what is for her. And the people in that welfare office know that the people who do that work, making a minimum wage, which is unlivable, those people are also on public assistance. So are many teachers who work. I mean, this combination between the impossibility of wages and the impossibility of social services and the impossibility of the housing market, I mean, it's just layered upon layer. And then there's the fact that she's now a single mother of a baby. And, what it takes to chase down child support, how much that child support actually is. I mean, there just isn't a corner of this entire apparatus. There isn't a wall in this labyrinth that feels passable. And she really did. She had plans. Like, she had a plan. On the one hand, it's sort of the myth of America plan. On the other hand, it's like a very actionable plan, right? Stay in school, which is paid for, get stable housing, have work study on the side, figure out state-funded daycare, not expect to have much outside of that until you're earning a real wage, doing real work, and frankly, work for the public good. Yeah, that was her plan. But I will say, in the shelter, whether the women who I knew were criminal justice students or hadn't gotten their GEDs yet, they also all believed in the myth of America. You know, there was a woman in the shelter who had incredible style, had a really great eye as a photographer, and she really believed, like, I'm going to be a fashion photographer. This is what I'm great at. This is my passion. I'm going to do this, and that's going to lift me out of this. I don't need to have a college degree to be brilliant at this. I'm just going to make this happen. Because the world has raised her to believe you're an American. All you need are your dreams. If you work hard enough, if you dream hard enough. And it's like, right, but that woman was born to a drug-addicted woman of color, and we all know what the system says about who you're going to be if you're the daughter of a drug-addicted woman of color, probably, right? Like, if your mom can't hold down a job, then you're going to be on the back end of every failure of our system, and you're going to grow up just having no stability, no power, no agency, no rock. And there she was, and left that homeless shelter to go into the New York City shelter system after being the most, like, according to the woman who ran the shelter, the most, like, exemplary, driven, the person who got it all done in a way that wasn't necessarily rocking the boat at times like Camilla did, but just keeping her head down and, you know, keeping her eyes on the stars, right? Mm-hmm. And we just tell these stories. We tell these stories about how anyone can be Jeff Bezos, right? Except, no, you can only be Jeff Bezos if you have a tax policy that allows you to be Jeff Bezos. I mean, just the whole machine. I feel like I'm spiraling out talking about it a bit, but I have to say that is part of why it was important to me to write a book-length narrative work like this, because it is about the intersection of all of these issues. The story of poverty in America for so many people is about gender as much as it's about race, as much as it's about education, as much as it's about housing, as much as it's about motherhood, as much as it's about psychological trauma. And mainly, honestly, I think all of those things add up to what I think of as the inheritance game, where there's just this exponential law of diminishing returns, which is, you know, if you were born into poverty, then you are so much more likely to be stuck in even a greater poverty than your parents were. And if your parents were born into poverty, then you're one exponent beyond that already, and so on and so on.
In the book, we get to see how all of these things play out in visits to government buildings to get assistance, on subway rides, in care facilities for children, at school. I mean, she made the dean's list, right? But you say even when she was succeeding and navigating all of these different places, you also say this was like one of the lowest points for her when she's supposedly succeeding at school. Do you remember that particular part of the book where you're talking about?
Oh, totally. I'm having this major sense memory of standing with her in the corridor of Kingsborough Community College and seeing her name on the dean's list and having this moment, like the anticipation of looking for it, seeing her name there, and then watching her face fall and knowing exactly what, you know, because I spent so much time with her. I knew her so well through this whole process, knowing exactly what that process was for her, was this pride and then this devastation that she wasn't going to be able to share it with anyone, that what was it going to add up to, that it was still like, I'm going to clock this success and then I'm going to race back to daycare, which is on the other side of the city. And then I'm going to grab my kid and go to now my overcrowded apartment in the Bronx where I don't even know if I'm going to be living here next week. And this wasn't the plan, you know? It's never, ever the plan for anyone. It never should be the plan for anyone.
It's such a difficult thing to witness through your eyes as you're seeing her. And we're seeing her just run around everywhere. It seems like she can't go anywhere without needing a piece of paper or like rescheduling a meeting or talk about all of the things she had to go through in the bureaucracy of poverty.
Yeah. When people ask me, what really surprised you while you were reporting? I always feel like they're expecting me to say, it really surprised me that homelessness is bad. Like, of course, you go into a book like this knowing how bad things are, hopefully, and wanting to expose it. But this was the thing I didn't know. I didn't know how totally bureaucratic and busted the whole system is. I didn't know that to get a check from the public assistance office to pay your homeless shelter $200 for that month's shelter rent or whatever, you would have to go to the welfare office 5 different times and wait in the waiting room 5 different times over 5 different days with your baby
for hours
and hours and hours and hours just to be told to come back, or that your case could be transferred to a totally different area and all your paperwork with it, but then you'd have to start over again. It felt like it was literally a full-time job, sitting in waiting rooms, waiting for people to tell her that's the wrong piece of paper, which it usually wasn't. Or, oh, that paper is backdated from last month. We need you to now go find the other paper to make it work for this month. Oh, but your worker isn't here today, so we can't even give you the piece of paper that can get you that other piece of paper. And my sister-in-law works in social policy out in California, and I was sitting in her kitchen in the middle of reporting this book one morning, and I was so angry and so beside myself, and I was just describing a day that I had just witnessed where we had gone from, I don't know, this one might have been child support office to child support office. It all blurs together into one just draconian nightmare. But I was describing all of this to Diana, my sister-in-law, and she pushed a book across the table at me that happened to be sitting on her kitchen table. And it was a book called Administrative Burden, which was written by 2 professors who researched this sort of thing. And the concept of administrative burden is that it is an actual burden to administrate all of this. The administration elements of poverty is intentional. It keeps people from making the most out of what the system owes them. It keeps people stuck on a treadmill that they can't get out of. I mean, these are all things that are pretty easy to fix.
Well, it seems like they're more concerned about not letting anybody rip the system off than they are with making sure the system's actually helping people that need it.
And the notion that people are ripping the system off is almost entirely a fallacy. It's really hard to rip the system off. And if people do it, they're doing it for a few $100s every, maybe there are 2 people in a big population who get away with ripping off a few $100s.
See, and I feel like someone would say, well, then it's working. That's what we want, rather than saying, you know what? It's actually worth maybe losing a little bit, which, again, still wouldn't be very common, to make it a better system to actually help the people that need it.
Though I do think that the notion of people ripping off the system, and this is something that I write about in the book, and actually there is an entire book about exactly what I'm about to tell you, which is a really good read, which is The Myth of the Welfare Queen. This thing that Ronald Reagan invented, where he had read one story about one woman in Chicago right before a rally in his first campaign, and it was one of the one of the most masterful racist wolf whistles in campaigning history, and considering the decades we've just had to look back on that saying something. But he completely exaggerated one story of one woman in Chicago, and it made this trope, right? This trope of the welfare queen, the notion that people, especially women of color who were in the system, were taking people's tax dollars to buy furs and Cadillacs, and they didn't want to work, and your hard-working money was going to give them this life of luxury. And because of that, we have this intentionally broken system that is frankly costing us a fortune because it keeps people mired in poverty.
Just in case, we don't want anybody
right.
Even though, as you said, that's not happening.
So imagine what it would mean for our economy as well as for, just on the tax side of things, if instead of having people stuck on this hamster wheel and living lives that are just it's a lot of trauma. It's a lot of depression. It's a lot of hopelessness. And there's not a lot of reason to think that there is much of an end in sight. Joy is found outside of the opportunities that other people have. Imagine if those opportunities were actually real. And we did have people like Camilla practicing criminal justice instead of on public assistance. If we did have people like the fashion photographer I mentioned at the shelter, at least like in a situation where she could go to junior college and become someone who works in something adjacent to her field, or I don't know, work as a receptionist somewhere and make a living wage and then do fashion photography on the side. Like these things that I think people who are raised with a modicum of stability can imagine their lives and then make those lives happen in a certain way. We're talking about a massive population of people who imagine their lives just the same way, who have just the same skills and just the same right to a life of meaning and self-actualization, and yet are just spending their lives in these waiting rooms, spending their lives doing paperwork that feels like it's out of Kafka or Orwell. It's mind-boggling, and it's not accidental.
I'm glad you brought up that welfare queen story, because sometimes Camilla, as you're with her, there would be, she would get her nails done, for example. And so, something nice, right? Something, quote, frivolous, right? And I think I think a lot of people would look at that and say, well, if she can afford to do that, or, look at her bag or look at her shoes, then she should be able to do X, Y, Z. There's this judgment that happens, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you about that impulse.
Oh, Blair, I could talk about this for like a whole dinner party. So I'm going to try to keep it brief. We're also lucky that we're talking in the morning, so there's no wine in front of me, because this is the thing that like leads me to the wine. I did an event with a center at Harvard called the Joint Center, which it's, the joint center between housing policy and the Kennedy School of Government. And we had this whole event around the book talking about housing policy. And the thing that a number of the professors who were on the panel with me wanted to keep coming back to was, but she just kept getting her nails done. And it felt like you were the people who know how expensive housing is. Joint center people, you are the people who know how much this is a systemic crisis. Do you think that a $10 manicure every other week is going to get her a lease somewhere? And it just felt like the idea that people shouldn't have some agency, some pleasure, some dignity. I mean, we're talking about like a 22-year-old woman who wants to feel confident, who, did I mention she's Dominican American? Do you know how important fingernails are in a certain subculture? I mean, I never cared about how my toenails looked ever until I started hanging out at this homeless shelter. From then on, it was either closed toe sandals or I better get the buffer out. I mean, we're talking about these small things that allow people to be something other than defined by what they don't have, by the shame of their poverty. And I just thought it was really important. It also, the nail salon was a home in many ways for Camilla. It's the nail salon that was in the neighborhood where she grew up. She would take the train like really far from Park Slope, Brooklyn, all the way to Corona, Queens, which, it's like an hour and a half to get there. So she could sit and gossip with the people who she had known ever since she was a kid. And just the price of that, I don't know. I think that when we start judging how people spend their nickels and dimes, when the real crisis is about issues in the thousands of dollars, we're not paying attention to the right issues here. It's really easy to tell someone not to get their nails done. You can't just tell someone to sign a lease on an apartment they can't afford. So, yeah, I mean, at first, it was something that I had to get over myself, too. It was like...
You call it the shoulds, like this impulse of they should do this, they should do this.
Yeah. And I think we all come loaded with those shoulds. I think we do it with anyone. People are judgmental. And I think that for some good reasons at times. Like, there are elements of moralism which can be important. I mean, I'm shooting all over this conversation,
Sure.
but I'm like shooting at our policy. I'm shooting at our elected officials. Things should be different than this. I just think it's much easier to should at Camilla for getting her nails done than it is to should at a massive, broken, intractable system.
That's Lauren Sandler. She's a journalist and author in Brooklyn. She's author of the book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. All right, time to get a little bit more personal. I want to talk about the ethics behind the book. As a journalist, you're embedding yourself in certain ways. It reminds me of, it doesn't remind me of this. I tie this into people who like go out and live like a person who's homeless out on the street for a night or something, right? Like they think that this can teach them something about homelessness. So you're kind of embedded in this system. You're spending so much time with Camilla, but you're also going home.
Mm-hmm.
You have a home. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, my privilege is a real thing. I am a white woman. I own my own home. It's easy to see what I don't have at times. I live in New York City and I'm not married to a hedge fund manager. I'm married to a photographer and we have to figure out how to make this life work for us. But we make a life work for us with a certain level of skin privilege and generational privilege. I have a happy, healthy kid who... I remember leaving the shelter one day and going home and writing a check the minute I got home for my kids' music lessons for a month and realizing that was pretty much the same amount of money that Camille had gotten for like public assistance that week. And, I remember like leaving the shelter and like going to someone's house for dinner and stopping by to pick up cheese and, a bottle of rosé on the way. And, you just sort of... It's a hard place to navigate. Not saying like, oh my God, it's so hard for me to be privileged. But I think it is hard to wrap the mind around because, on the one hand, well, okay, like getting into the real ethical heart of this, like, yes, there's always class difference. There's always economic difference, etc. But in this situation, I also felt like unless Camilla was going to come and live with us, which is something I really write about and wrestle with in the book. Actually, I'll just tell the story. So
yeah,
I think it was when she was getting evicted from the shelter, but honestly, her housing stability was hanging by a thread in every possible way you'll see through the course of the whole book. And my kid had gotten really close with her and her baby. I'm someone who... If you read the book, you'll see there's some real boundary issues that I have in general. I'm not someone who says, tell me everything about your life. I will tell you nothing about mine. I want to know your whole family, but you can't know mine. Like, I feel like you are sharing yourself. I'm going to share right back. And so, we do things like we move her from house to house. Like we have holidays with her. There's a real depth of relationship there. And then one day I'm talking about how I'm really, really worried that she's going to end up on the street. And I'm scared about that. And how for me, that was like the line that I didn't know if I could let her cross that line. But we weren't there yet. And the whole point of this book was to see how she could get herself out of this bind, to see if it was possible. It wasn't to save her. It was to see how she could save herself in a broken system.
It was to witness,
Yeah,
right?
to witness entirely. But my kid just could not believe that we weren't asking her to come stay with us. She could not believe it. And I think my kid was, how old at the time? Maybe in third grade, and was saying to me, what is this? This is someone you love? This is someone who we love? This is someone who you spend all your time with? You're telling me these horrible things? How are we not opening our home? And I write in the book, this is when I explain to my kid what a hypocrite is. And there is an inherent hypocrisy in this in some ways. In other ways, the point was to witness this so that nobody has to live like this, so that hearts and minds change, so that policy changes, so that we open up a different way of living. And luckily, we never got to the point where she was sleeping on a cardboard box. I think that would have been the line I had to cross. But I did set up ground rules from the beginning. I said, listen, I'm not giving you money. Like, that's just, I will buy you presents and buy food when I am with you. Like, you're never picking up lunch. I'm picking up lunch. And by the time, like, I totally loved her. So it was like, for your birthday, we're totally going out and I'm totally getting you those earrings and, things that weren't going to change your life, but just things that you do with people that you care about. But I said, I'm not giving you any money. That isn't going to happen. And she didn't ask for it. She never asked for it. She never challenged that. I said, I think that we need to have a real firewall between us on social media. She's, like every 22-year-old, social media obsessed, whether, I have yet to meet a homeless person who doesn't have a smartphone that at least hooks up to Wi-Fi somewhere if they don't have a phone plan. And I said, it's really important that your identity is protected and that you have the right for that you get to determine, not someone else, if you want this story to be owned under your own name. So I didn't want anyone to find her through social media. And I said, and I feel like I need to draw a line at my house while we are reporting this because I don't know how I'm going to keep it up otherwise. And I think that it was the last one that hurt her the most. That she, she didn't come over for dinner. Like, she didn't do the things. I went over to her house for dinner, like, she's a hell of a cook. And she knew that I was too. But I didn't cook for her in my own house. And that felt like a betrayal. But these all felt like, okay, how do we manage this story without interrupting it, knowing that, of course, I'm changing everything by being there. I'm with her all the time, and yet allow it to have its fullest realization without my interruption. It's a hard thing to navigate. A lot of journalists do this by having really strong boundaries, not talking about themselves, not introducing people to anyone in their family or their friends or whatever, and we were at the place where Camilla was like, so is John still in the friend zone about a friend of mine, Because I don't know, we're people. I'm a person. She's a person. We're people with big hearts and big desires and big ambitions. Of course, we were going to connect and love each other and care.
Would you have any regrets about how that played out?
That's a really good question. Camilla did not want to read the book until it was published. I really, really wanted her to read it before. I wanted her to know what was in there so that A, I could fact check it with her. B, she could determine if she felt endangered by anything that was in there. I wanted her to protect herself. She knew what she was getting into talking to a journalist, obviously. I mean, as we've discussed, she's like being with an attorney all the time. But she never told me that anything was off the record. And I walked a very intentional line where, there's a ton of stuff that isn't in the book. When I teach nonfiction, I always say nonfiction is more what you leave out than what you leave in. You witness these endless moments, and which ones are you going to pick? And my strategy is always to you figure out the clothesline of a project, what it means, what it's really about. This book was about the constellation of factors that keeps Camilla homeless. And if it didn't hang on that clothesline, no matter how juicy, suspenseful, meaningful it might be outside of that, it didn't go in the book. So there's a lot of stuff that I felt like I was able to protect her from just by that method, that mission. But, it's hard to be written about. And she read the book and she had a hard time with it. And it wasn't my job to protect her. And I felt like there were things that I did to be as ethical as possible on that side of things. But I don't know. That's the one thing that I regret, is not somehow getting her to read it before it went to press so that we could have really talked through it together.
Do you have any connection with her at this point? It's been, about a year and a half, 2 years since it came out?
Yeah, I know. It came out in April of 2020, the week that deaths peaked in New York City. It was a hard time to have a book come out. That's another story.
Yeah, big party for that, yeah.
When they didn't know that Amazon was still going to carry books. They didn't know that the printer in North Carolina would be considered an essential business. It was down to the wire. It was wild. All this was happening while I had COVID, while my husband had COVID, while he's out covering COVID. I mean, whoa. But, that said, Camilla and I have an agreement where we don't talk about her and her relationship with me from the time the curtain closes on the end of the book. And in fact, there's an epilogue in the book that she felt like that even pushed what our agreement was. So I'm going to not say anything, even though you can probably tell that I'm dying to talk to you about it.
Yeah, but I think that's
yeah,
fair.
no, I mean,
fair.
it's such a privilege that she opened up her
You
life
realize
to me
readers
this way.
want to know
I
it,
know,
right?
I
Like,
know,
because
I know.
you connect us with her. Like, I felt so much for her. But again, I think that should serve as a reminder to readers that this is a person, and this is a person that is worthy of dignity and respect and all of the privacy at this point that she needs. She's already, by agreeing to be in your book, given us more than I think anyone should have had to give. So
yeah, I think she thought it would feel different than it has. And honestly, I mean, having written about people for 20-something years now, I think everyone feels that way. I mean, I've been written about. You know, when I'm profiled, I always feel like, what?
what? Yeah.
Take it back. I mean, like
fair.
puff pieces feel bad to people, and this is
Yeah.
this book is really exposing someone who is struggling and at her most vulnerable.
You talk about her sexual life. You talk about her intellectual life. You talk about her religious life. There are so many intimate things in here that that really clarified it for me when you said, when you've seen other people write about you, you're like, wait, what? Like, even when it's a good thing, you're just kind of like, okay, that's a really interesting little me in a box there that seems very alien from who I feel like.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you know, Janet Malcolm famously wrote The Journalist and the Murderer, which is sort of the tome on considering the relationship between someone who does what I do and someone whose name ends up in the book. And it is a complicated relationship always. And it is one that I at least know I am actively wrestling with at all times. But yeah, it is not an easy dynamic.
All right. Well, I got one more question before we hit the break, and it's that when people find out that you've written about this, if they're like me, they want answers about, well, what can I do? What can I do today? Like, what am I supposed to do? What do you say in response to that question? Because where do you start?
Right. I mean,
Like...
well, that is sort of the question is, this is a vast systemic problem. This is a problem where if you are Bezos or Zuckerberg or Gates or Musk, you can write a check for $20 billion and everyone in the country will be housed. Like, there are, because of our situation as an economic structure in this country, there are individuals who can make a massive difference individually. Also, because of that structure, many of us can't make a massive difference individually, but we can as a collective. So if you can find a shelter that needs support, if you can, I know this is like all so generic and old school, but if you can make this an issue that really matters to your elected officials and have them start really advocating, if you can agitate, if you can make sure that this is a human rights issue and everyone knows it, if you talk about it, write about it, educate your families about it, make sure that it's something that people feel accountable for outside of their own experience. Like, take everything that we learned about how to be anti-racist and, this is just another version of that it's not enough to just like shake your head or feel like you're not part of the problem. Like, this is the world that we live in, and we, to a certain extent, still have some power to create it. And so, yeah, I mean, there are organizations in every single community that are trying to do everything they can in terms of services, outreach, policy change. They're doing it on a shoestring. They're doing it screaming into a wind tunnel. I feel like we all know the things, our shoulds, like the things that we should be doing. And I know it's hard. I know there's not a lot of bandwidth. There's not a lot of money. It's been a really challenging couple years, and we all felt like there wasn't enough before then. But I would invite you to read this book and to seek out anything else you can that can help you internalize the experience of this so that it feels like more than just a should. So that it's more than just like, oh God, what a horrible story in a world of horrible stories. Like, if you can invite this into your experience, you will probably find the places that you know in your community and in your world where you can go with this, which there are a lot of places and they need you. And, just do a Google search. I have a website, laurenosandler.com, that has some resources for some of this on it. But, they tend to be pretty New York oriented or national. I really recommend you thinking locally about who's doing the work and helping them do that work.
That's Lauren Sandler. She's the author of the book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home, which I also want to mention was named a notable book of 2020 by the New York Times. She's also appeared in the New York Times, Slate, The Atlantic. She's worked with NPR on All Things Considered and Morning Edition. And it's been so awesome, Lauren, to have you here today at Fireside. This is awesome.
Blair, you are awesome. This podcast is awesome. And I'm just so excited to listen to what you're doing next.
We'll be right back after this for a best book recommendation. The fire is dying down. It's about to go out. So we'll get that book recommendation and everybody can go home. All right, we'll be right back. Hey everybody, it's me, Blair Hodges, and I'm throwing that last log on the fire as we're getting ready to wind things down here. But I wanted to take a second to acknowledge people that send in reviews. And let's take a look here. We have one from Lusatron who says, this podcast is the refreshment. All right, thanks. This is like the mint brownie of podcasts, I guess. I hope so. That's what I'm trying to cook that up. Newell Brown says, if you're looking for a place where religious ideas are explored in creative and thoughtful ways, then look no further. Thanks for that review, Newell Brown. I love reading these every time they come in. El Matsby left a 5-star review as well as Newell Lista. Said they said they love the podcast and it always leaves them feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah, I like that sort of, and I may have said one or more of these in the past, but I wanted to give a shout out to everybody who's left a review. So J.R. Watts, great follower on Twitter and friend. G Function, Just a Has-Been. Benjamin E. Park, Professor Park, a great friend of mine, left a 5-star review. Susan 2U, someone who says love Reddit. They must have set that up as their Apple review name. Mika Hall, Lindsay T, Tara, Terruh. That's a clever way to spell it. The Janitor 84 as well. Buzz Allen, Scott K. Hicks, and then someone called Mom and Dad Have iPhones. So that brings us all up to speed with everybody who's left a review so far. It's not too late, though. You can go leave a review in Apple Podcasts right now. You can also rate the show in Spotify if that's where you listen. You can give it a 1 to 5-star rating. Before we get back to the interview, I do want to let you all know we're closing in on the end of Season 1. This is a 10-episode season, so in 2 weeks we'll put the final episode out. And I'm happy to announce, however, that Fireside will be back for a second season later this year. I'd love to see the audience continue to grow. I'm really grateful for the people who are listening and joining us so far. Let's keep this thing going. In the meantime, you can re-listen to some episodes, or if later in the year seems too far away, there are some old episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast that I used to host for about 8 years. There's a back catalog there of over 100 interviews to choose from where I interview different scholars of religion. So you can check those out. All right, well, okay, let's get back to it with Lauren Sandler. We're back with Lauren Sandler, and today on Fireside, we talked about her book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. But we also like to talk about other books and other things to read or watch or listen to or whatever. This is your opportunity, Lauren, to tell us about a best book. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
I was thinking about this question. Things like best books tend to really freeze me. I think in part, I've like endless fights with male friends of mine who are really into like ranking best albums and best songs and best films. And it's just not the way my brain works. And I think it has a lot to do with like, I don't want to be gender essentialist, but, I do think that like when you were trained on baseball scores, or if you've, served in the military, or not that there aren't women who do all those things, but there's a way of organizing the world that is super gendered for a lot of people. And my brain never went there. For me, this is like choose your favorite children, which actually people can do.
I'm not going to say that. I'm not No comment.
This is why I have an only child, so it would be easy for me to answer that question. But, it did get me thinking about the books I was thinking about when I was writing this book, which both feels like a flub and an opportunity. So I wanted to talk for a moment about what led me to crafting this book as I did. Writing about poverty is not easy to write it in terms of how is it going to feel suspenseful? Because frankly, a lot of poverty is really boring, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a shelter after curfew, how much happens? If you're on the subway going from appointment to appointment in New York, you're just sitting for hours. You're sitting in waiting rooms for hours. You aren't given the freedom at times, if you are living the life that Camilla was living, to it's not a car chase. And yet I knew that this is a book that needed to be a suspense narrative. And it also needed to be it needed to be closely observed. It needed to be modernist in some way. It needed to just be just a straight line out of the gate. And so there were two books that really meant a lot to me before I started writing this book, and I kept coming back to as models of craft. And they are Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf.
I love that book.
And The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
I love that book.
Two very, very different books, right? A book about a woman in London who's planning a party and getting the flowers herself, right? And just sort of this day in the life. But it ends up being about so much more, where that level of close domestic observation brings in so much feeling and so much texture and so much grief about a very, very tangled world. And then The Road by Cormac McCarthy is about this father and his kid in this dystopian, apocalyptic landscape that are just literally walking down a road trying to survive. And it is massively suspenseful, minimalist. I just felt like if I can achieve some element of what these two books are doing and apply it to then the forms that writers like Alex Kotlowitz and Jonathan Kozol, Alex Kotlowitz wrote a book called There Are No Children Here about a couple boys in a housing project in Chicago that when that book came out, it changed my life and really showed me what I wanted to do as a writer. And then, because even as an atheist, I can say God is good some of the time. It was Alex Kotlowitz who reviewed my book for the New York Times. And it was oh my God, put me in a time machine and send me back to being 22 years old and obsessed with There Are No Children Here and tell me that I'm going to write this book that will feel like this to me and I can be proud of like this and it will feel like this to him in the New York Times. But, Random Family is a book that I mentioned earlier, which I think is a real model of this. But one thing I will say about these books of nonfiction, and frankly, all of the books that I just mentioned, they are all books by white people. And we do not have a great, rich history of deep narrative nonfiction about social justice issues written by people of color, in part because we live in a system that has a media culture and a publishing culture that has always been so white. And these have always been sort of the prize assignments, right? To get funded to do some immersion project. And the notion that, it's some sort of poverty tourism, it's complicated. And I really want to note that I want to see more nonfiction, and not just memoir, but reported nonfiction coming from different voices about these topics and from people who are working in craft and not just in sort of in more of sort of a daily journalism, hard journalism way. I mean, we know that there are people with extraordinary stories that they want to tell. We have a publishing culture that leans towards the personal. And I think that having more and more personal nonfiction, memoir about these issues is really, really important. But I also want to see other people from other backgrounds reporting out these stories because, Camilla's story would have looked different to anyone who wasn't me. And I just, I think it's really important that we are seeking out books that really mean things to us that aren't necessarily what are getting the biggest marketing budgets or the biggest sort of hoist up into the canon or or the bestseller list, because go to your bookstore, go to your local bookstore, ask the people who work there what has changed their hearts and minds, what has moved them, what makes them feel deeper or differently about something that they thought they really had a beat on before. Buy those books from your local bookstore and then tell your friends to buy them. I mean, this is how the whole thing works. So
you can also call your local library and ask them if they don't have it to buy it as well. Like,
this
libraries can get
this
it in
is true.
stock.
Yes, absolutely.
This ties right into Kiese Lehman's episode. We talked to him just a couple episodes ago, and he's a Black writer who's doing that sort of memoir reportage. I mean, and we talk in the interview about how difficult the industry has been and how it in some ways has conspired against fostering this type of authorship. And it's still happening.
And it's always been whiter behind the curtain than it even is on my side of things. And so, you know, there are some real moves to make changes there. There have been significant changes in the past year, and that is a very, very good thing. But, you know, pull back that curtain when you can. Read stories about how the things you love are made. And if you wonder why other things aren't made, be curious about it, because our world is very much made by people who make these choices. It's how we understand what the world is and what matters and how we're supposed to feel about it. And it was an extraordinary privilege to be able to write this book for Random House. And it is the work that I became a journalist to do. But I got to make sure that it's not just me who is not just doing, you know, a personal story, but the ability to tell other people's stories too.
And before we go, what's next for you? What are you working on?
Well, my agent has my new book proposal right now, and so I'm like refreshing my email nervously all the time. You know, no matter how many books I write, it never gets less anxiety provoking somehow. So I'm hoping that what my next book will be another work of narrative nonfiction that talks about something vast and systemic through a closely observed family story. But in this case, it is about a pastor who believes that he is prophetic, is an extreme right-winger, was on Trump's immigration committee and election committee, and who believes that we are in a civil war and that people need to be stockpiling guns to fight the other side. The other side he defines as anyone who has resisted the truth of Trump's reelection. And he has 5 children who were all raised within his church, and every one of those kids has become a leftist.
Wow.
Artist or activist. So it's about looking at this incredibly divided family, this ideologically just rendered family. And
do you get to be pretty close with the family themselves? So they're actually, okay.
They're down for it. So, yeah. So it will hopefully be a way of telling, you know, like a Southern family story, stories that I love, 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 in that sort of closely observed American novel way, except it will be nonfiction, and it will, I hope, speak very much to these times we find ourselves in.
Well, that sounds excellent. Lauren, I want to say again, thanks for being here. This has been fantastic.
Blair, talking to you is an absolute pleasure. Please invite me back, or I might have to invite myself.
Okay, thank you. Fireside with Blair Hodges is sponsored by the Howard W. Hunter Foundation, supporters of the Mormon Studies program at Claremont Graduate University in California. It's also supported by the Dialogue Foundation, a proud part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I hope you enjoyed this discussion today. Thanks for being here at Fireside with me. As I mentioned earlier, we're almost done with Season 1, and I'm happy to announce, though, that Fireside will be back for another season later this year. And if that seems too far away, then maybe you can go check out some old episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast, which I used to host for about 8 years. There's a back catalog there of over 100 interviews to choose from. Don't forget to connect with me on social media so you know what's coming next. It's at PodFireside on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm also preparing a little newsletter so that we can stay in touch in between seasons. You'll get more details about that in the final episode 10 of Season 1. And I would love to hear from you about the show. In fact, I'd love to have you on the show. So tell me, what was your favorite episode? What did you enjoy about this season? Was there something that you wanted to hear more about? Was there a question that you had? Tell me a little bit more about you. What I'd like you to do is send me a voice memo from your phone. Just record it on your phone and then email it. You can send it to blair@firesidepod.org. And if you do that, you might be featured on an upcoming episode in between seasons. Fireside's recorded, produced, and edited by me, Blair Hodges, in Salt Lake City. Special thanks to my production assistant, Kate Davis, who created the transcript and helped with the website. And also thanks to Christy Branson, Matthew Bowman, Caroline Klein, and Kristen Ulrich Hodges. Our theme music is by Faded Paper Figures. Thanks for joining me at Fireside with Blair Hodges. It's a place to fan the flames of our curiosity about life, faith, and culture together. See you next time.